Greetings, everyone. My name is Shibashish Kumar Sen. I welcome you all to Diplomacy and Beyond, an initiative of the Institute for Cultural Relations Policy. Founded in 2012, the Institute for Cultural Relations Policy aims at fostering scientific education and public discourse regarding cultural relations. At ICRP, we believe that cultural relations policy will be a key factor in international relations in the 21st century, and therefore our work focuses on global intercultural dialogue and cooperation, aiming to promote the protection of human rights and recognition of cultural diversity and heritage in an interdependent world. That said, in pursuance of our objectives, we welcome you all once again to another session of Diplomacy and Beyond. The event, Diplomacy and Beyond, active since the year 2015, was a highly popular event that brought together the world of diplomacy to the youth. Discussions were held by interns in our headquarters in Budapest, followed by a Q&A session with the audience. However, due to restrictions imposed by the pandemic, this event is being held online. This session of Diplomacy and Beyond will consist of our distinguished guest address on the theme European Values on the Global Stage, followed by a moderated interview. The speaker's presentation will range for about 30 minutes, followed by a moderated interview. And towards the end of the session, the audience can interact with our guests and put forward their questions. This webinar is a part of the Visegrad Academy of Cultural Diplomacy project. The project is supported by the Polish Ministry for Culture, National Heritage and Sport, co-financed from the Cultural Promotion Fund. The Visegrad Academy of Cultural Diplomacy project is coordinated by the Institute of Economic Diplomacy from Poland and partnered by the Institute for Cultural Relations Policy from Hungary, Young Conservatives from Czech Republic, and Civic Democratic Youth from Slovakia. Today, we have a very esteemed guest present before us, Dr. Hannes Swoboda. Welcome, Dr. Swoboda. It's a pleasure to have you here with us.
My pleasure.
Prior to serving in the European Parliament from 1996 to 2014, Dr. Swoboda was engaged in federal and municipal politics. In his role in Parliament, he occupied a double function as both a representative of the Social Democratic Party of Austria and the leader of the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats. Currently, Dr. Swoboda acts as president of the International Institute for Peace, a non-governmental Vienna-based organization with the mandate of promoting peace and non-violent conflict resolution across the world. In addition, he has been appointed as the president of the Vienna Institute for International Economics, the Center of Architecture, the University for Applied Science, Campus Vienna, and the Sir Peter Ustinov Institute. Drawing on his experience in European politics and other professional appointments, Dr. Swoboda will be addressing the tensions that arise in the process of promoting European values abroad, while also remaining mindful of existing local customs and cultural practices. I would now like to invite Dr. Swoboda to deliver his presentation on the theme for today's Diplomacy and Beyond event. Over to you, Doctor.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this invitation to speak to an interesting, not easy subject. I would head my presentation with the title, The West, Culture, Tolerance and Conflicts. Specifically, I put in tolerance because this is a very ambiguous expression, but we use it very often, but we should, of course, know where and when we could be tolerant towards other cultures or not. This is an open question, of course, we want to discuss. Well, the expression of conflict and culture, of course, is very diverse. We have different opinions about it. It has different shades. And very often, of course, culture is hiding more or less deeper conflicts, economic conflicts, political conflicts, societal. So we have to know that always what is seen as a cultural conflict not always is primarily a cultural conflict, but is covering other issues of the conflict. Certainly this discussion or this talk I want to give now is coming from a Western perspective. But of course, I try to be self-critical, as we should be in the West, even much more than we have been in the past. For centuries, the West, America, Europe, or let's say first Europe and then America, and some of the other countries have influenced other regions. They have created conflicts. Sometimes they have solved conflicts. More often they have created conflicts. But anyway, economic, military, political, and cultural power has been exerted by these Western powers or Western countries. And what we see now is very often a result, the conflicts we see now, often a result of the past dominance and maybe a waning, diminishing dominance of the West now. For example, the competition with China is primarily one because China is growing and many people in the West, politicians, especially in the USA, but not only, see that as the big conflict of the future, China as a rising power. Sometimes even they have the illusion they can stop China being a big economic political power. That does not mean that everything should be accepted, but we'll come to that later. And the second big global conflict for me is, of course, the conflict between the so-called Christian value-oriented conflict and Islam. Sometimes also you could say, of course, also between Hinduism and Islam. When we look to India, because that's obvious, I have to look also to India. So I think these big conflicts, the one which is more an economic and political one, but still there is some cultural element behind it, the West China, and the other, of course, between Islam and other religions, especially the so-called Judeo-Christian, or maybe Christian religion, from the European perspective or the American perspective, of course, are the two important conflicts. Now, how do we define conflict? I would say conflict is, and I want to quote, it's an active disagreement between people, maybe individuals, groups, or states, with opposing opinions or principles, which results in one or both sides not being able to satisfy its needs and aspirations. So conflict is not just you have different opinions, you can have different opinions, but if these different opinions lead to non-satisfaction for the one or for both sides, then there is a conflict, and that is necessary to know. And concerning culture, how can we define culture? Well, I would say it's the sum of ideas, customs, social behavior of a particular people or society. And predominantly, I will underline that we have, of course, to include also religion into culture, because, as I mentioned already, religious conflicts are here. Today, it seems that many people, many political movements want even to underline that culture is important for identity. Very often identity is used as a singular, the identity, the Muslim, the Hindu, the European, the Christian, or whatever state you take. Now we forget that we have many identities. Everybody of us has many identities. Religion is some of it. The national heritage is one. The tribal, let's say, origin, the ethnic origin is one. The profession, whatever, the family. So it's always in every one of us has this kind of cultural identities and multiple cultural influences. If you look to my name is a Czech name, so it comes from the Austrian-Hungarian Empire when my grandfather has been born in Bohemia, but my mother has been born in Hungary. I have been born in Austria, in Vienna, near Vienna. So already here, it's one of the examples, even in Europe, of course, you have these quite different identities. Secondly, we have to underline culture is some liquid expression. It's not a fixed state. We always look at culture and say, this is the culture. Yes, this is a view of the culture for the moment. A culture is, as Edward Said, this famous Palestinian, Middle East expert said, There are no insulated cultures or civilization. Any attempt made to separate them into watertight compartments does damage to their variety, their diversity, their sheer complexity of elements, their radical hybridity. So that is important to see. And Ilya Troyanov and Rani Toskote, they wrote a book about this culture, and they said it's a confluence. Different rivers are coming together. And as you know, with rivers, there's a Greek expression, pantare, that they always flow. And of course, different influences come into these rivers. So that is important. When you look at this culture as having many different roots and confluences, then of course it is clear what also Amartya Sen, this Nobel Prize winner, says very clearly, coming with an Indian origin, that, and I want to quote again, our cultural identities can be extremely important, but they do not stand starkly alone and aloof from other influences on our understanding and priorities. Other things such as class, race, gender, profession, politics also matter and can matter powerfully. So culture cannot be seen as an isolated force independent of other influences. End of the quote. We will now take a very recent example, Afghanistan, and the obvious failure of influence development in Afghanistan by the West, by military action. One of the reasons, of course, is the history of the country has not been seen. This country, and you know, people from India know it, of course, much better because they're much nearer to the country, has always been characterized by different fights between different ethnic groups, but also between modernizers who wanted to modernize and fight against headscarf and other limitations, especially for women, and those who said we have to defend the real Islam, the Islam as we see it, as come to us, delivered by Muhammad, but in the name of God. So you already see that, of course, you have this kind of different situations and interpretations. Anyway, and here I want to quote Jeffrey Sachs, who had his own experience when he advised how Russia should be developed and promoted the economic development after the breakdown of communism. And he failed there, but at least he learned from it. And he said recently, I quote, "The magnitude of the United States failure in Afghanistan is breathtaking. It is not the failure of Democrats or Republicans, but a abiding failure of American political culture, reflected in US policymakers' lack of interest in understanding different societies." And it's also typical. Of course, you can say this is true also for many Europeans. So it's true in some way for the West. Maybe America is even stronger because they are so, let's say, proud of their own culture and understanding, but in fact, very often they don't understand other cultures. If we speak of history, of course, we have to speak of colonialism. And colonialism was an economic, a military and political and economic issue, but also cultural. Very often, immediately after the colonial soldiers came, the priests and some other cultural activists came in order to say, now we have to bring the Christianity, the real values to these people, these primitive people. And there often you have this kind of feeling of inferiority, which was brought by the Western powers to many of the countries. One has to see to the Indian history, you can see it very well. In Africa, you can see it very well. And still it's here. This kind of feeling very often, we have been humiliated in the past, and maybe even today you have this kind of position from the outside and this perceived inferiority. One of the elements, one of the examples, of course, is that in many European museums, you have still many artifacts, many cultural goods, which have been more or less robbed, which have been stolen. And now you have the debate in Europe, what should we give back? Maybe, of course, obvious stolen goods should be given back, but maybe also this would be a way to think about how can European museums and new museums in Africa and other countries can jointly look into the history and create new connections between European cultures and African cultures or other cultures from other regions. So even these stolen goods, which are still in many of the museums, some of them have been given back, but only very few, could be used to bring in a discussion about different kind of cultures, religious customs, and say, let's speak about it together. Let together present at least the dubious goods, which are not clearly stolen, but maybe you don't know exactly. Some of the states are no longer existing, etc. So I think we should try also to use that cultural artifacts as a means of coming together, not of new separation. But still, very often, as we spoke about colonialism, it's not past. You have still some of the Western arrogance you can see in extreme forms. You saw it in Abu Ghraib in Iraq and the prison, how some of the people have been treated by American soldiers. You saw it in the Vietnam War and in other wars. You could also say it sometimes in Afghanistan. So it is a very, let's say, contradictory position the West has. On the one hand, we say we defend cultures, values. On the other hand, they are not expressing or implementing these values themselves in their own attitudes to other people. So there's a strong necessity of the West to reconsider their own position in the past, but also in the present. It's not only say whether colonialism is past. And you see the inter-American debate, also in Europe partly, on the Black Lives Matter, that it's not only something of the past and the relationship between the Western countries and other countries, it's also inside the West, you have these kind of contradictions and this kind of task you still have to do in order to be, let's say, to get rid of these colonial and neo-colonial activities. Of course, the past should not dominate us, but the past, as famous writer Tennessee Williams once wrote, the past is not dead, it's not even past. So it has an influence today. One element I want to underline, of course, is religion, because one could think that religion is something from the past and not from the present. But de facto, religion plays a big role, sometimes even used, as I said before, to underline the identity. We are Christian, we are Hindus, we are Muslims, and we have to make it clear that our religion is the right one. So there are fortunately many people who say, well, we have this diversity of religion. Every country, every person has the right to choose. But sometimes you see in many of the countries that it is clearly, the message is clearly given, one religion is the real one and the others are not the real one. Even inside, for example, the Muslim religion, you have this fight because most of the victims of extreme fundamentalists are Muslims themselves, which are killed or imprisoned or whatever because they have not the right interpretation of Muslim. And it's not only Shiite versus Sunnis, it's also inside the two big streams of Muslim that the Taliban say it's not enough. You're not enough believer and you are not strict in following the religion rules. Of course, very often religion is just a weapon, because if you use religion as a weapon, then you have God on your side and you can say, well, you cannot contest this kind of religion because there's God on our side. If you look, for example, inside the West, to the conflict in Northern Ireland, which is very often done or interpreted as a religious one between Protestants and Catholics. In reality, it's very much an economic and social issue. If you look to Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, and the different following states of successor states of Yugoslavia, in the Catholic religion, the Muslim, and the Orthodox, de facto, there's very often the social and political misuse. There's not much difference. Cyprus between Greek and Turks. So very often, look to food, look to music. It's very much mixed, and also in the Middle East. And even inside the Orthodox Church, if you look between the Orthodox, Russian Orthodox and Ukraine Orthodox, or the Serb Orthodox and the Montenegrin one, where there have been clashes even recently, it's absolutely crazy that there are clashes, because there is no real substance in it, but it is it's politically motivated. Now, coming to the next point, which is globalization, we could expect that globalization would diminish or reduce at least, and even abolish some of these characteristics, and to use a word of Friedman, would flatten the cultural world. But it is not. It is not, and we still have that kind of vital differences we have. One, of course, element which is very important and much in debate is the role of women, and the possibility of women to live an independent, or let's say a life which is similar and equal to men's life. But as we see, especially, of course, again in Afghanistan, the big question is, how can we, who are convinced that all people are equal and that have to have equal rights? They are not equal in the sense that everybody is the same, everybody is different, but they have equal rights. How can we try to implement and foster and enhance these rights? And here we come, of course, to the question of tolerance. I mentioned before that tolerance is an important issue we have to discuss. Can we have to have tolerance against or towards everybody, towards every kind of activities? Have we to tolerate that women are persecuted, that women are imprisoned more or less at home because the culture is here that women don't have these rights? Or should we do something against it? There's a big debate about in the West, how tolerant should we be? And one says, Rainer Vost, who is dealing very much with it, says, well, at least if you don't tolerate a culture, you have to have very good reasons to express it. And at least you have to try to engage also with those who have a different attitude, cultural attitude, for example, concerning human rights. Wendy Brown, who is also a very famous expert on this issue, of course, wants to underline that very often this kind of non-tolerance by the West is again an expression of colonial behavior. We cannot tolerate what we don't see as the right culture, the right values, the right religion. At least what is necessary in the West is some sort of self-criticism about the cultural crimes the West did itself. But of course, that does not mean that the crimes done by the West can justify the crimes done by other cultures. I think we should be in a position where we say in clear, let's say, openness and clarity, what has been done wrong by the West and Western cultural impact. And then, of course, say what is wrong by other countries. But we need a sensibility. The West needs more sensibility for other cultures, not to accept everything. Even Samuel Huntington, who wrote this famous article and then book about the clash of civilization, which is very often misinterpreted, that there is an automaticism that civilizations have to clash. And the question, of course, is what is a civilization? He wrote in his famous article in 1993, it will require the West to develop a more profound understanding of the basic religious and philosophical assumptions underlying other civilizations and the way in which people in those civilizations see their interest. For the relevant future, there will be no universal civilization, but instead a world of different civilizations, each of which will have to learn to coexist with the others. This is a difficult task for every side because there are many civilizations or several civilizations or subformer civilizations. And with that, I want to come to the last point, which obviously is, of course, important, concerning Europe. This united Europe, you can say it's not so united as it should be, and I would agree. But this kind of Europe was constructed after the Second World War. Very often it is seen as an economic union. Yes, it is an economic union in many respects, but the reason, the origin was not economics. Economics was the means, the method to unite or to bring European countries together. But the origin was that European leaders wanted to overcome a situation where we had two world wars coming out of Europe in the last century, the First and the Second World War. And this World War, especially the second one, has been very much connected with the Holocaust, with the killing of people, with ethnic superiority, especially for the Nazis, but of course in the past also ethnic superiority felt and expressed by colonial powers. And at least in Europe, we wanted to overcome this kind of antagonism and say, let's work together. And of course, economic issues and methods have been used in order to bring Europe closer together. We are now in a situation where sometimes this origin is forgotten even by its own people. And they say, well, the past, the Second World War, that's long over, and the Nazi regime and the fascists and the communists, that's long over. No, it's not so long. If you see historically, it's not so long. And there is, but the danger is that inside Europe itself, and that's in the West, but you saw it also in the US, especially with some of the supporters of Trump, not all of them, but some of them, that there are people who are not interested in democratic decisions, in openness, in solidarity, in respect for other cultures, but in the contrary, they don't want to respect other cultures. And therefore, this power of European Union also in the West is declining, because in their own countries, you have this kind of new arrogance towards some of the refugees or immigrants or different cultures and religions. Europe now, and the US of course as well, but I speak about Europe, is now in a difficult situation because it always has been the idea, we are democratic, we are open, we respect other minorities, or respect minorities, other religions, whatever, and therefore we go worldwide in fight for the same principles and values. First of all, inside Europe, you have this contest. And secondly, that you yourself democratic or feel you are democratic and that you respect certain values does not give you the power and the possibility to influence all other countries that they respect the same values and principles. And again, let's look to Afghanistan as the last example. What should we do now, especially? We saw that this imposing from the outside by military means is failing. And it's not only failing in Afghanistan, it fails in Iraq and many other countries. Should we accept everything? How can we come into a dialogue with, for example, the Taliban, who are not the most open and dialogue-ready people, but still we have to do it. So I would say, yes, European Union and also America should not, after leaving Afghanistan militarily, say, oh, whatever happens there, I don't mind. But we should be very clear, we cannot impose certain values and cultures from the outside with military means. That does not mean that we should not have a dialogue, at least with those who have some readiness to go into a dialogue. Those who are perhaps have learned that to put women into closed houses and give them no possibility, that maybe this is not so in substance, vital substance of the Islam religion, because you can also have very other opinion on these issues, even if you are Muslim. So and this is really the final conclusion from what I say. You should work on your own country that cultural values are respected, are accepted, are promoted. You should bring these cultural values also into international dialogue and diplomacy, but you should have good arguments in respect also of the specific cultural situation of the countries concerned and their history, why it would be good to promote, for example, human rights, especially rights for women. It's not a question of imposing it by military force or political force or economic sanctions, but it is mostly, as far as possible, by convincing the other side that to have certain principles which are embedded in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Fundamental Rights, to keep them, to observe them, would be helpful for the country's development itself. Yes, there are, of course, many other issues where one can talk, but I should close now, and of course, open to any kind of questions. I think, yes, culture is an element of promoting conflicts, but could be an element also of solving conflict if you, and the West, comes with humility, with pragmatism and sensibility to the different cultures and does not try to impose their own ideas, either military or whatever other means. Thank you very much for your attention. And I want to close with that, my short introduction.
Indeed, sir, that was a very enlightening session for us. And as you said, that rigidity should be avoided. Anything which is rigid, and people should be perceptible to more changes, for it said that nothing is permanent except change. And that's why they should be open to more diversity, embrace more diversity and cultures. And imposing have never achieved anything, whether by military sanctions or economic sanctions. So without further delay, I would like to start with our question and answer session. And Sir, Dr. Swoboda, our first question is, in delivering international aid and humanitarian intervention, how can policymakers strike an appropriate balance between being sensitive to local customs and promoting normative, generally Eurocentric values, such as women's right to freedom and education?
Well, first of all, one has to discuss what is a humanitarian intervention. I think Afghanistan was none, Iraq was none. So finally, maybe one added afterwards, when one was there and one has seen that the military, the war cannot be won, then one said, well, we are here to promote women's rights. So from the beginning, many of these interventions have nothing to do with humanitarian aid. It's not only economic, where somebody said it's all economics and all look for oil and whatever in Iraq and Libya. Finally, yeah, there's a lot of oil, but it's not so much coming. And in Afghanistan, there are at least, there are many resources, as we know, but they have not been exploited by the Americans primarily. So there are many different reasons. So yes, a humanitarian intervention I will not exclude. Sometimes it is necessary, but I would say it's much more important to try to come into a dialogue and try to, when possible, for example, to enhance the people inside the countries, NGOs and others, how they can strive for it. Finally, the change has to come from the people itself. It cannot be done from the outside. And that kind of change, of course, is difficult to reach. Very much deplore when Russia or China and some other countries now interfere into social media and block some social media because they don't want to have this kind of influence. And Russia, for example, but not only these countries, has decided that you are easily a foreign agent and you have to at least register as a foreign agent if you take foreign money, which doesn't mean that you're a foreign agent, but it means you have support from the outside in order to work and to be able to work inside. There's no clear answer, but I would say very few interventions are out of humanitarian purpose. And this responsibility to protect, which is instituted in the UN family, should be used very carefully. One should always first study the situation of the country concerned, whom one can help. And it's very dangerous that, for example, also in Afghanistan, the Americans of the West used some of the local warlords who were not very, let's say, humanitarian in their activities. They were killing very many people, but you cannot say, well, killing the one is better than killing the other. So be very careful, be sensible, go into the country only if you have a clear, first of all, a mandate, and then a clear vision how you will develop the countries and how you will support the people inside the country. And don't ally yourself with people who have an interest to fight against the old regime, but would put up a new, equally cruel regime. So that is the only thing I can say. Careful, restrain yourself, try, even if it's long-term, to go for dialogue and discussion and help of civil society, then go in for yourself.
Thank you, sir. Sir, our second question is, the spreading of European values is among the things that the European Union seeks to improve. According to von der Leyen Commission, what do you think would be a good way to improve the spread of European values from the current state?
Well, again, I'm a bit doubtful about the expression European values. I would say they are part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, most of them. Now you can say this declaration, which was passed in the end of the 40s, was still dominated by the Western countries and was, American influenced, European influenced, and was not a really universal discussion before they were passed. What Europe is that it is more, let's say, trying to implement them. And of course, they have been developed. For example, the sexual rights, the sexual diversity. But still, of course, on the other hand, if we look into our own countries, Black people or colored people are very often discriminated de facto. If you have a certain name, and you apply for a job, you very often are neglected or are very low on the list, and that has been proven very often. So first of all, I think is the best way to spread European values, so to say, or these universal values which we care for in Europe, is to implement themselves in our countries, and then to give a good example to other countries. And then, of course, solidarity to help. We saw it with vaccination. Unfortunately, we didn't have enough vaccines for ourselves. But of course, if China delivers vaccines much more easily and quickly than we do in the West or in Europe, then other people will say, what about the values? I need a vaccination, and I need a help now, not values. So I think it's very important that economic development, support in crisis situation is so that people in other countries see, okay, these are societies which promote solidarity and help for me. And then I will also take some of the values, because then I can see the connectedness between the values and the question of solidarity and help and support.
Thank you, sir. So the next question is, does Europe still have enough power to act accordingly to its true values in the absence of American help, despite the democratic deficit we are living through?
I think we should be honest, moderate in our aspirations, not say we can do everything in the world and we can spread all the values if we cannot. We have to accept that other countries are there and have their own attitudes. I know it's not easy. We negotiated, there was, as you mentioned, many years in European Parliament, and still this is the case that this kind of negotiations go on trade issues. Very often we connected human rights with trade issues. Sometimes it was only a trick, because if it's with human rights connected, then the council, member states have something to say. If it's only on trade issue, it's just the Commission and the European Parliament who have the final say. So it was not always some sort of honesty behind it. But I'm doubtful that you always can combine it in this way. Maybe it is rather better to separate, to try at least to separate, as we did recently, of course, with China, to say, look, we are not agreeing with what you do with the Uyghurs and in the western provinces of China, but we want to have some trade with China because we need to connect China into our world, and we need to have China as a partner in the climate policy. So it would be good to be more pragmatic. And we can do that, of course, also without the United States. We should not be too dependent on the United States, because as we saw also now with Afghanistan, but the United States has its own agenda. When we can be an ally of the US, we should do it, but it should not be an automatic one. And we should be more pragmatic, as the US very often is. And we should not always combine every issue together, that we separate ourselves from the rest of the world. Even in India now, it is called, Biden has his idea of union of meeting or congress or committee, whatever, of democracies. We have different opinion about democracy in India today, but that does not prevent that we should work together with India on many issues. And we have very different opinions about democracy with China. But also Europe has to have some interlocution with China and some channels of communication and even cooperation. So more pragmatism in the way we implement our ideas and values would be very welcome.
Exactly, sir. Thank you for this answer. More synergy is required at such hard times and with the backdrop of the pandemic. So let's hope for the best. So the next question is, how can Europe promote cultural tolerance in the backdrop of rising Islamophobia and anti-migration stance by European states?
Well, I think concerning Islamophobia, it is very important that you differentiate between respect for the Muslim religion, respect for Muslims, and rejection of extremist ideologies. Very often is mixed, and you speak about Islamism without defining what it is. I think what we have to reject is, of course, that any religion, de facto it is very often the case with Islam, that some minorities of it define what you can do and what you should not do. They define it for their own Muslim colleagues, but even sometimes even from the state as such. This has to be rejected. We fought in Europe for many centuries to find a separation between religion and state, and for a liberal attitude towards all the religion. And this can only be the line. You have it more extreme maybe in France and in other countries, but de facto this kind of separation is clear. That in Catholic countries like in Austria, the Catholic clergy plays a bigger role than the Muslim one that's a fact. But still, there is a clear separation, and all the official religion have been accepted. In Austria, it is even from the beginning of the last century that the Muslim religion is an official recognized religion, and that should be the case. Concerning refugees, yes, it's a pity. Of course, if you have a welfare state, and most European countries have a welfare state, then it means if all of a sudden come more people, you have to share the same amount of money with more people, and you have to find jobs and so on. Nevertheless, you see in my country, in Germany, in other countries, in the countries who took many refugees, that the integration is overall functioning. There are, of course, critical elements of it. There are some people who violate the laws and are even killing people because they have whatever reason. Can be no acceptance. But overall, the integration is functioning, and there are people from Austria, from Germany, who are killing people and are violating women's rights as well. Nevertheless, we have to fight against that. Is it a problem for implementing our values and principles in other countries? Yes, it is. Therefore, you cannot be intolerant in your own country and preach for tolerance in other countries. It is not. Therefore, I think it is very important that those in Europe who are fighting for equal rights, who are fighting for integration of a limited but nevertheless important number of refugees, that those people continue the fight and make it very clear that you're only Christian if you are solidarity with those who need solidarity, and express this kind of solidarity. So that's an element, the core element of the Christian religion is solidarity, is help, support, and that has to be not only said in the church on Sunday, but has to be a principle of life.
Thank you, sir, for this answer. So our next question is, how does European Union continue to hold on its value of safeguarding and empowering rights of the minorities at a time where there has been a rising hostility against religious and ethnic minority communities in Europe and across the world?
Yes, this is a similar question, or I would give a similar answer. I think it is possible. It is a permanent fight. Nothing is forever guaranteed, neither democracy nor the acceptance of minorities. I think, of course, it has to be clear that it's a two sides obligation. People who come in, especially from the other countries, religion, cultures, have to accept that they live in a different kind of culture. They cannot say, I'm coming here as a refugee or as a migrant, and now I want to change the culture of the country or the attitude or the customs. But also you have to have an integration attitude from the countries where the refugees are coming in. So if both sides try to meet each other, then it works. And it works predominantly. If you looked in our country, I'm coming in Vienna, and Vienna is full of many cultural influences, many citizens from many countries. First, of course, it were the countries of the neighborhood. It was from the Bohemia, from Hungary, from Balkan countries. Then, of course, it developed, and we have many, many people from many countries. It's a really multicultural city. So it works if people are ready to accept that not only their own attitude and custom, but also the others are acceptable and are not disturbing each other. Even it can be a cultural improvement, amelioration. It can have exciting results. So I think those who see the positive side, and it is very visible, should also fight for it. Very often, in the countryside, far away from the big cities, the rumors are spread, and most of them are politically spread. They are not spread by chance. They are spread by those who want to win politically out of it as extremist parties, and that has to be rejected.
Exactly, sir. People should try to meet halfway, and we should also embrace the diversity. This is what makes this planet beautiful. So our next question is, how can European Union tackle the ongoing humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan that has begun to unfold with the Taliban takeover over the state machinery, and at the same time deal with the impending refugee crisis that is likely to unravel in the upcoming time, while ensuring that it does not compromise with the values and ideals?
Well, I think we have to be pragmatic. We cannot say everybody can come. I fully agree. Also, even some poor countries like Albania, Kosovo, accepting refugees from Afghanistan. I think we should receive those who are really persecuted and really, let's say, in danger of keeping their life. Secondly, of course, we have to support the neighboring countries. Neighboring countries are very often taking many refugees. Most of the neighboring countries are not rich countries, are poor countries, or poor regions in the countries. So I think we should support them financially with direct aid. And we should have a discussion with the Taliban. The Talibans are the power for the moment. And it seems not only for the moment, for a longer time. We should have a dialogue that we are ready to help them, not in order because we like them very much, but of course with the condition that they accept some basic principles. If we always speak about women's rights, then we should say, let girls go to school, let girls go to university, even if it's separated at the university, men and women. I don't like that in our country this functions very well, they are not separated, but we cannot again impose it on the others. We can ask the certain principles accepted where human rights are at stake. And then we can also help. It's a question of a dialogue. If we now discuss, should we respect Taliban, accept? It's not about accepting. We are not accepting them. The people are accepting them because otherwise they wouldn't have won. If there would be a big outcry in the country against them, then it would have shown it was very small. Now we have to help the people there, and it's not for us to fight against the Taliban forever, but for us it's to help the people concerned, and that is possible. Limited number of refugees we can take in Europe without, having political backlash. We can help certainly the countries in the neighborhood. And thirdly, we should try to influence the Taliban with also financial support to accept certain conditions, including, of course, the economic transformation away from an economy which is very much dependent on producing narcotics de facto. And even here we can work together, of course, with India, we can work together even with Pakistan and China and Russia and Uzbekistan and Iran, because they all have an interest not to have too many narcotics in their own countries distributed and to the young people. They all have an interest of certain stability. They all have an interest that not the new extreme forces settle themselves in the Taliban country like ISIS. So there are some common interests, and we should try to convince the Taliban that this common interest should also be their interest.
Thank you, sir. Sir, our last question is, how far do you think has the European Union been successful in socializing citizens to support the democratic values, norms, and ideals it has promoted since its inception? What do you think are the challenges that lie in lieu of these aspects as the EU seeks to transform itself into the most successful regional bloc in the world?
Well, I think we have been very successful, but with all success, it's not done forever. You have to fight again and again. And if people forget, and the terrible past is many years ago, there are new generations, you cannot, it's a different if you experienced from yourself or from your parents' stories, what the Second World War meant, what Holocaust meant. But it's different if a young generation is growing up and say, well, don't tell me these old stories, it's a different Europe. And then it's not only a different Europe, then they start to discuss maybe, again, this kind of nationalism and why are we not stronger enough, and why should we, for example, in COVID, when we waited for the vaccination. But you see, many people criticize we don't have enough vaccines. I don't speak about India and many other countries who have much less vaccine to fight against COVID. Now then we have 61% or 62% vaccinated, and it's more or less a stalemate now. So people change very much, when they first say we have to have vaccine, and then if there's enough vaccine, they say, okay, I don't mind, I will not get it, and if I get it, I go to hospital and so on. So people have this kind of tendency that in a crisis and when the conflict is still in their mind, they want to follow certain rules. Once it's passed and it's over and they're used to it, they think, why should I follow the rules? I have my own interest and I will not go in that direction. So that is important for the next generation of politicians in Europe to regenerate, rejuvenate the ideas Europe was based on to be successful. But you have, of course, to combine it with economic success. If people have no job, then you can preach them many values, but they will say, what about the values? I want a job, I want an income. So this question of security, of course, health, job, social security, these are all issues which we have to solve also in a new world, which is not so secure, not so safe as it was in the past.
Thank you, sir, for your answer. And now I would like to ask Bashish to undertake the question and answer session from our audience. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Dr. Swoboda, for answering so insightfully into the various questions that were raised during the course of discussion. Now, we have some questions from the audience as well, which we would like to take up. First question we have is, according to statistics from UN Women, women's participation increases the probability of peace agreement lasting at least 2 years by 20%, and by 35% the probability of a peace agreement lasting 15 years. How can women's participation be encouraged in conflict areas such as Afghanistan, where the culture and values are so different from our European or Western ones?
Well, I see even in European and Western countries, women have not been automatically involved so much as they should. Of course, we did some work on it, and some of the foreign ministers, and there was also some, also here in Vienna, we had some activities where foreign ministers came together. We had two women foreign ministers in my own country. Of course, there was Hillary Clinton and several in other countries. But I think it is very important that those who are active in diplomacy or in politics enhance the role of women, especially also in peacekeeping, because I think it is very important that women also have the understanding of the problems very often women realize in their own countries. Women very often, let's say, the pillar of sustainability in the families, in agriculture, and of course in family as such. Women education is very important. In some countries where we have too strong population growth, it's very much connected that many women are not educated in higher degrees, have no profession, and that of course leads to the fact that women have more children than perhaps they can even organize economically and socially. So I think it has to be done primarily by women themselves, but of course men should follow and should support that activities. We have, or in our institute, we have a vice president, Angela Kane. She was Deputy Secretary General for Disarmament and is very active in this issue. And we have two colleagues, women colleagues, who are active also in that direction, and others at the UN in headquarters in Vienna. So I think there is slowly starting this kind of thinking that it's not the same if men or women deal with these issues. But I agree, it's not enough what has been made, and much more has to be done in order to promote women's role in peace activities, in peace agreements, in implementation, especially of peace agreement, which is very important. Sometimes you have a peace agreement, but if you look to the implementation, it's way far away from what has been agreed.
Yeah, truly. And the foundation of any strong nation is built on the role of the women, how much they are able to contribute to the society and the role that they carnage in everyday aspects, be it, contribution to the economy, contribution to the infrastructure, healthcare, and so forth. So the next question we have is, during history, many peacekeeping and peace enforcing missions have failed because of the idea that countries such as Rwanda, Afghanistan should adopt a democratic outlook in the name of theories such as democratic peace. There is a lot of fervor in reforming peace-building mission. How can the United Nations promote peace, stability, and human rights in totalitarian or authoritarian countries? And how should the UN reform the peace-building programs, respecting local cultural values and promoting a peaceful environment based scenario?
Well, I think you mentioned the guy who was asking the question, the person mentioned two countries, Afghanistan and Rwanda. Of course, they are quite different, but still, you have to decide if the non-democratic, autocratic orientation, is it out of the culture or is it out of personal, let's say, aspiration of the leaders? In Rwanda, for example, you have a leader who was very helpful in overcoming the terrible genocide and promoting new and economic development. Then, of course, you read books and articles about how he persecuted, even killed, or seemed to kill, according to this information, even some of his former colleagues who helped him in the past, because he wants to make it very clear that he alone, the president of the country, is responsible for whatever can help in the country, can happen in the country. And you have also in the neighboring country, in Uganda, situation where you have a president who did a lot of the things necessary, but you have also a situation why his possible opponent, Bobby Wine, has been put into prison, has been tortured, and so on. So it's not always different culture. It's sometimes it's a different culture of the leaders, the autocratic orientation of the leaders. And even in Afghanistan, of course, you can say it's one of the culture interpretation to have, for example, women discriminated. They wouldn't say it's discriminated, it's differentiated, let's say, rules according to the culture. But you had also many leaders in the past in Afghanistan who promoted a new, or let's say an open interpretation of Islam, which allows, of course, the equal rights. So maybe it is also good to look into other Muslim countries. If you look, for example, Iran, there are many things I would criticize in Iran. But if you look to the universities, you have more female students than male students. Every girl can go to university. Or I don't know all the details in Pakistan, but even in Pakistan, you have a different situation. Unless, of course, you have sometimes very strict rules by the families or concerning the religion and so on. So it is very clear to differentiate what is culturally influenced or what is just an interpretation by the leaders in order to stay in power, in order to keep their power and their dominance. And that, of course, the West also should respect and see that there is a difference if it's a cultural or a non-cultural element in it. And as I said before, culture is not fixed. Look, Muslim religion, I'm not an expert on it, but I read a lot of books. If you see that also in the Middle Ages, you had religious leaders and philosophers from the Muslim side who were very open-minded and very tolerant to others. It's not that they never had an enlightenment, as is often said in Europe, the Muslims have to find their enlightenment. There was an enlightenment, but then there was a return back. Some of these, let's say, fundamentalist leaders who are the predecessors of even the extremist ones, they thought their countries are not competing, are not able to compete with the West because they have been opening themselves too much to Western influence. And this kind of combination of Islam and Western influence doesn't function. So they have to go back to a very restrictive interpretation of the Muslim religion of Islam. So we have really to be very careful in accepting all the differences only because it's a cultural difference. We have to have sensibility, as I said before, in the attitudes towards other countries and their cultures, but also make very clear where it is just an excuse for authoritarian leaders not to lose their power, not to go for re-election, or for continuing and perpetuating their dominance, and then say, well, this is our culture. If it's not the culture, very often it is power grab by very autocratic leaders.
Thank you very much for your answer. Moving on. The world has certainly changed since the advent of social media. There is no doubt that in today's scenario, there has been a rising intolerance and insensitivity towards certain groups in our society. How do you see the role of social media in promoting this intolerance?
I think the social media, as many others, have two possibilities. One, of course, to give a person the possibility to question autocratic system and autocratic leaders, to rally people who are opposing the leaders, as we saw during the Arab Revolution and so on. But on the other side, it is very often seen as an influence by let's say, very negative oriented people with many prejudices which are distributed, including vaccination. Look, the fake news which are distributed by social media very often prevents people to go to vaccination because they say, oh, well, I don't know, I've heard something. And of course, the same is true about minorities and their position. Some countries, in addition, try to even to block social media, not because social media do a bad image, but because or those social media who are open-minded, who are trying to question and challenge autocratic leaders. Anyway, Democrats are too timid. They are not strong enough active in the social media. They give the field or leave the field to the very right-wing or, let's say, extremist positions. That's a pity. Of course, we know from psychology that the negative sentiments are much easier accepted and spread than the positive ones. That's a problem. That's a problem with social media. But nevertheless, I think democratic parties, movements, media should try also to use social media to counterbalance the negative influence of social media run and organized and used by extremist forces. That's the only way. I don't see any other way to at least mitigate these negative influences.
Thank you. Moving on. How do you see the role of globalization in contributing and strengthening the cultural differences that exist between different states and different nations?
Again, globalization has, as I tried to mention in my talk, has a double effect. The one is in, let's say, in unifying some values and orientations and interpretations, in more or less flattening the world. On the other hand, I think globalization can also bring about the variety of thinking and thoughts and cultural expressions around the world. It very much depends on who is active in the social media and who is active in trying to give the globalization a certain image, a certain picture. Very often people in the West especially said, now the reaction must be to deglobalize. I think it's impossible. We live in a globalized world. Why should not I speak with you if you are in India, and wouldn't be interested to see that you tell what you think in India. Of course, you are one of many, many people in India, and not everybody may share your opinion. It's the same is true for me. But at least there should be some explanation. Or traveling. Some people say, well, you shouldn't travel, you shouldn't fly anymore because of the footprint, the ecological footprint. I think the better thing would be that the planes would have a fuel which is carbon neutral, whatever hydrogen or whatever fuel it would be. We should go in that direction. Not to meet other people in other countries is not a solution. Not everything can be done via Zoom. It's good to have this kind of instrument. We should use it. But that does not, now if I see you and I speak with you, you can even explain the culture. But if I am in India, as I was several times, it's different if I'm going to Rajasthan or to Tamil Nadu, and even see the difference in India, between the different provinces and regions. So the same is true for Europe. And globalization should be, of course, run in a more considerate way, in a more, let's say, sensitive way, also promote the acceptance and respect for different cultures and attitudes and religions on a mutual basis. I should respect your religion and you mine, or non-belief if I don't have a religion. So it's a way how we define, or let's say how we characterize and implement globalization, and then it can contribute to, let's say, to a much more understanding. For example, let's take, because I'm dealing with this, African art. Of course, you can have pictures, but if you don't know the country and the region, African art of today is very interesting, like Indian art or any other kind of art. So I think the cultural exchange should be part of globalization. Should not be on an economic term where we get goods and send goods. It should be also a way how we exchange cultural attitudes, cultural artifacts, cultural behavior, in the sense of preventing conflict. Because whatever we spoke about solving conflict, maybe it should be first to prevent conflict.
Truly agreed. So, why do you think there is a resurgence of neo-colonialism and discrimination in today's scenario? And where do you think the solution lies in tackling these rising tendencies, which we see in today's global order?
Of course, if you're separated from the rest of the world, then you can say they should exist there. If you meet them more, and if people come and exchange, then there's also the danger that, of course, you say, oh, I don't know the people here, why do they come? And they have a different culture, and it's easier that politics say different is inferior. Or we are superior and they are inferior, then you have this kind of behavior. I think it is more the question that we never really did in the West speak open and frankly about colonialism in the past. And even if you look what the British Prime Minister Johnson and his Minister of Culture said, and was formally said also in France, to look at the positive element of colonialism, that's a misuse of politics again. Let the people discuss, let the experts discuss what has been positive or negative. And let the Indians say what has been positive about British colonialism in India, and not let the British Prime Minister or whoever. It's not about the personal attack, it's about, because it's very visible and Trump, of course, was even more extreme. We have many museums, we have many institutions who can discuss it, who can question it, can challenge it. Of course, there has been this destruction of monuments. You can discuss if that is the cleverest way, but at least it challenged, because for many centuries, it was not a subject of discussion. Nobody really apologized for what has been done in the past. You very often in Western, you say you have to apologize for the bad deeds. And I don't want to compare colonialism with what the Nazi regime did. It was incomparable in some way. But at least there was a clear cut made, and apologies, and judges, Nuremberg trial and other judges decided about what the people did. But with the colonial power, more or less, it was not done. So it is, let's say, we do it now because it hadn't been done in the past. And this discussion should go on very honestly. not saying that whatever is wrong in India, in Nigeria, in whatever country is only because of colonialism, and to give an apology to any misdeed of any of the politicians of today. But that some of the structural effects, deficiencies of the countries they have, some of them are really oriented towards colonialism. Anyway, it's not a right of any country to dominate another country and to march with the soldiers into the country, even if it's benevolent and I want to help them. We see what it means helping this country. So let's openly discuss it. There's a lot of literature done on written today, and I think it is a necessary work done, which should have been done many, many, many years, at least decades before.
Thank you for your answer. Moving on, the European Union is undoubtedly built on common values and principles, but it is undeniable that among European countries, there are certain differences. Hungary, for example, even this year has demonstrated to have a different perception of what the EU calls indivisibility and universality of human rights regarding the LGBTQ community. Do you think this will exacerbate the relation between the EU and Hungary in the future?
Obviously, it will. You can, of course, discuss issues, let's say, how important the question of LGBT rights is and how important you should promote these rights, but to accept the rights and take it for granted, this is a value, a principle which the European Union is standing for, because it's about equal rights for everybody. You may have your own opinion and can say, I don't think it is good, and I think the family in a traditional sense, man and woman, is the best way how to promote and establish the society. But the right of people who think other and do their job properly and go in that direction has to be accepted. It's a misuse of so-called Christian family values done in Hungary, partly in Poland, and partly in some other countries. And it's a deliberate political purpose. It's a purpose as, if I go for these values, I know I will, let's say, violate some rights of some people, but that's not so important for me. Important is that I get a majority by emotionalizing the issue. That is done. It's not that people say, I have a different opinion. You can have a different opinion, but to emotionalize this question and say, this is the value I promote and this other is not a value, it's even a bad habit, that of course is only done politically, and that will give disturbances inside the European Union, especially between the other European countries and Hungary and Poland. And we have even some rules now that this can be sanctioned. And I think the European law has to be accepted. There are even now people, especially in Poland, who try to say national law is above European law, but the European principle is that European law is above national law. Of course, European law is only in those elements where there is a competence of European Union. European Union is not built in a way that any European decision is above the others. If the competence is not existing for European Union, then they cannot pass a law on it. But if it's a European competence, and therefore we have a European Court of Justice, that is very clear, and Europe cannot live if every country does what it does on certain elements, then the union of value is totally destroyed.
Certainly agree. Moving on, we'll take two more questions. Many people have questioned the ability of the United Nations and also developed countries at large to resist and genocides, especially the one in Myanmar happening to the Rohingya people. What would be a way to make sure that crises and genocides are reacted to in a much quicker way, but also to make sure that interventions are not seen as some form of Western imperialism?
Well, what would be necessary is to have a common support for these human rights and the violation. If we have, for example, China in the case of Myanmar, who is not interested in supporting the human rights question, but is interested in just supporting whoever is in government in Myanmar, especially the military government, then the UN cannot do anything. UN cannot do anything if some of the major countries are blocking decisions by the UN. And we see now that very often the UN is blocked by the US, by Russia, by China, mainly by these three countries. So it's not only China and Russia, it's also the US is very often blocking decisions of the Security Council, which is a supreme organ and more or less is the organ which is permanently in session and can permanently react quickly. I think one way, of course, is that all the countries go again into a multilateral stream of decisions. Very often in the past, you saw that multilateralism was thrown overboard, was no longer the main way how to deal with international issues. Mr. Trump was very much against multilateralism, but also Russia and China more or less said goodbye to multilateralism because they are, when they became stronger, especially China, it was not so important for it. But there are many questions which only can be solved together. Maybe this restarting of a dialogue between the big powers can bring in an attitude where multilateral issues or multilateral solutions can be found again more, more easily. That would be very important. Therefore, I'm very critical about this Cold War between US and China, even if Mr. Biden now at the UN said he is not interested in the Cold War. I think, I don't know if China is interested or Russia is interested. I think we should get rid of this kind of rhetoric and readiness to accept a new Cold War, because that means even less multilateralism than in the former and the first Cold War, because conditions changed. So yes, it would be very important. Also in Afghanistan, the UN could play an important role. And it was a big mistake by the US president to go out of Afghanistan without trying to get the UN into it together with the neighbors, of course, because Afghanistan is not only an issue of an internal issue, it's an issue also of stability of the whole region and, of course, of implementation of human rights. So I agree, it would be much better to have the UN more active, but that means that a dialogue between the big powers has to restart and to give multilateralism a new chance.
Certainly. I think especially in the times of crisis, the role of international players and especially with developed countries becomes more paramount, especially when we say in terms of upholding the rule of law and promoting democratic rights. So finally, the last question we have for today's Q&A with the audience is, over the years, there has been an increasing trend of growing disappointment in democracy, especially in the recent events of what happened in Afghanistan. What would be your main points or argument in favor of democracy as a preferable alternative to autocracy as the organizing principle for society of human beings?
Well, I think if you speak about democracy, you could, or I could repeat what Amartya Sen said, that in democracy you can change government. And if the people, the majority of people are not satisfied, they can change it. In autocracy or in dictatorship, of course, it's not possible. But of course, you have today many, let's say, gray forms between black and white. You have autocratic regimes where you have elections, like in Russia. Many people say the elections were not really a fraud and were not really representative, but nevertheless, some of the outcome and the people have at least the possibility to express it, even if it's limited. Or in Iran, you have democracy, but it's limited because the choice of the candidate is not done by the people, but by some supreme authority. This is the one thing. Secondly, I think we should recognize also from the example of Afghanistan that maybe the most important thing is not to have election at the first thing. You had elections, but not a real functioning state. The state was collapsing immediately. So what does election mean if the state is collapsing immediately if there's a first attack? So maybe it is more important also for democracy to have a functioning state, a state which is fulfilling the major needs of the people, which is at least reducing corruption, or at least is reducing the power of some of the warlords. You can vote for parliament in Kabul, but if your warlord is dominating your region and is doing what he wants, and he wants especially his own benefit and profit and not the one of the citizen, it doesn't mean anything that you have election. So first of all, yes, democracy is important, but democracy can be built only step by step and must fulfill the basic needs: food, jobs, security. These are the issues. Then people will also go for election, and then election have a purpose, have a possibility to influence the final decision. So again, even in Afghanistan, it was done the wrong way. If, I'm not for the intervention, but if it should have been done, then you should have started in order to give some basic structures out of the culture and whatever it is, and slowly develop a functioning state, which also can control in some way what regional authorities and dominant leaders are doing, and then going for elections. This proud, we have elected. You know, I know, for example, President Ghani is an honest man, and I know him, had discussions with him in the US in the past when he was still an expert, but I never thought that he would be able to run the government as a technocrat. You have to have other people there. But he was elected and it was democratic. But at the end of the day, it didn't help, because with the first storm, he left the country. I don't want to say this is a bad thing, but it shows that to have an elected president is not really proof that democracy is functioning. So we have also to rethink and to think first about some stability, some authority, some functioning organizations functioning in the interest of the people, and not only in the interest of some small groups. And then you can have election, and then you can develop democracy. But it's a very complicated, long way, and you have to work with much more sensibility than to say, election, wonderful, everything is done. We saw Afghanistan prove the contrary.
Thank you very much, Dr. Swoboda, for answering all the questions in the Q&A. Thank you to the audience for sending in their questions as well and making it such an interactive session. With this, we come to the conclusion of today's Diplomacy and Beyond event with Dr. Hannes Swoboda. Thank you very much, Dr. Swoboda, sparing your valuable time with us and for gracing this occasion, and so insightfully presenting your views on the different aspects ranging from culture, history, and the other aspects of the changing world order, and how there is still hope in the tools of diplomacy, negotiations, when it comes to resolving crises, especially when certain things have been hostile, especially towards certain communities across the globe. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
It has been truly a pleasure to host you.
So it was indeed a very enlightening session, and I was able to know about so many different perspectives, like which I've never thought of, like so many different things. I have always believed in a multidisciplinary approach, but I was able to know so many new things, And I can think on these things from these perspectives as well. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for your questions and your moderation. Thank you very much. It was very nice to be with you.